What if the very systems that once limited aerospace innovation are now being dismantled by the cloud? Let's explore how Tim's transition is bridging two critical worlds. Welcome to the first segment of our deep dive into the aerospace industry's digital transformation. Today, we're joined by Tim Murnin, a seasoned professional whose journey from Boeing to AWS is really an example of the convergence of traditional aerospace expertise and cutting-edge cloud technology. Tim's trajectory offers a unique perspective on how our legacy aerospace companies are embracing digital solutions to enhance efficiency, reliance, and innovation. His insights will shed light on the challenges and opportunities that come with integrating cloud technology into an industry known for its complexity and precision. So, Tim, first of all, maybe give us a quick introduction. Who are you? Why are you here?
Yeah, nice to see you, John. So, as said, my name's Tim Murnin. I lead our aerospace as well as our high-tech electronics and semiconductor industry solutions team at AWS. So I've been here about 4.5 years now after about 16 years at Boeing in a variety of supply chain roles. So I came out of the business side of Boeing where really we created one of the first integrated supply chain organizations, not just at Boeing, but in the overall aerospace industry itself. Prior to that, I spent a lot of time in consulting and with various other technology companies, including what used to be Manugistics, now part of Blue Yonder. So my background in supply chain spans multiple industries, but the bulk of my time has been with aerospace.
It is. And, it's great. It is great seeing you again, Tim. It genuinely is. And for those that don't know, Tim and I, we've had a great relationship over the years in AWS. So it's fantastic to have this chance to join him in, in a more informal setting and just get some of these insights out of him. But that doesn't mean we're not going to be interrogating you, Tim. So stand by for some questions. So look, I mean,
I'm always prepared for your challenges.
The thing I always loved about whenever you and I have been talking is, you're able to sort of bridge that notion of the whole strategic down to the tactical. You've got a real detailed understanding of what's happening, under the hood in aerospace. So maybe you can help by unpacking how some of those traditional aerospace experiences have shaped your approach to digital transformation in the cloud.
Yeah, I think one of the key things to think about, and it might go without saying, but everything in aerospace gets linked to the airplane that's coming out the factory door at the end of the day, or the airplane that's being delivered to the customer, or the airplane that's in flight. So whenever we think about digital technologies or the cloud or anything else, we always anchor that thoughts on how does it benefit the airplane? How does it benefit the business? So, there's a lot of focus around cloud and AI and various technologies today, but there's not room in aerospace to look at cool for being cool. You really need to anchor it in what is the business value and how does it help the program manager or the pilot or the passenger experience improve what they're trying to do at the end of the day. So my background in supply chain, one of the biggest challenges we always had was trying to understand what supplier performance was going to be. So whereas in an organization like CPG, you're very focused on demand forecasting of finished goods delivery. Well, in the aerospace industry, you kind of know how the plane gets delivered to the customer at the end of the day. So what you're focused mostly on is backwards looking in terms of what are the requirements you're putting into the supply base, what are the risk factors in the supply chain, and how do you start to address those? And technologies like the cloud and like AI really start to unlock opportunities in those things that we haven't seen before.
So I think it's really interesting perspective, and one of the advantages of your previous life as a consultant as well is that you'll have looked at lots of different industries. And the advantage of sitting in AWS, of course, is that you also get to see how lots of different industries are applying cloud technology. So maybe if we could sort of double tap for those not familiar with aerospace, what are the challenges that are uniquely aerospace, or what are the solutions that cloud is solving that are uniquely or particularly valuable to aerospace customers?
Yeah, thanks, John. So I think a couple of things that distinguish aerospace, particularly from large-scale industrial manufacturing and in other ways, is, first of all, when you think about the types of volumes that are going through an airplane factory, we're talking about what are relatively low-volume, low-mix operations lines. So even if you take a production line like the A320 at Airbus, which they're hoping to get to 75 aircraft a month in the next couple of years, that's still on a relative scale, a really low volume of manufacturing that's going through. So when you're thinking about things that might pertain to a lot of manufacturing, things like OT technology and edge work and things that are happening where you're monitoring factory performance from a machine perspective, well, I won't say that doesn't have any applicability at aerospace. It's much less important than understanding what are actually happening in terms of the manufacturing floor, in terms of part shortages, labor issues, safety issues that may be coming through. And that's really what spans top of mind. So what we focus on from the industry perspective is how do you integrate data from all of those disparate systems that are coming from different places into a single environment so that whether the head of manufacturing or the program manager has a common visibility layer for where they are. Because the other thing to keep in mind from the aerospace industry is it's a highly regulated industry, whether we're talking about commercial aircraft or defense aircraft. And most companies have a lot of restrictions on the ability to share data, leverage data, whether that be from a regulatory perspective and things like ITAR or GDPR or Gaia-X, and how different countries and different regions of the world have to secure their data. But even internally, they may have very strict policies around, for example, who can see data related to a particular supplier performance. That you may only be able to access that system if you're part of the procurement team, for example. But at the end of the day, if you're a mechanic on the shop floor who has a missing part, you need to understand where that part's coming from and what the delivery schedule is. So the things that we try to do is overcome those barriers, not by violating those data security and data sovereignty issues that are out there, but by respecting what those things are, but also providing visibility at the point of use for where people need to solve problems that leverage that data.
So I think so again, very data heavy, but and also, if I can say, strategic in terms of our wider understanding. So maybe I can ask for something a little bit more, in the woods, as it were. So can you give us a specific example, regardless of defense, US, EMEA, whatever, a place where, AWS has come into the aerospace industry, is dealing with a client and helping them overcome a specific supply chain challenge?
Yeah, so we're working with a customer right now who's a large OEM today, and exactly that same challenge. So one of the things they need to understand is when I leave the day, when I'm a shift supervisor or I'm the head of manufacturing, did I win the day? Did I produce what I said I was going to produce? And so if you go into an average airplane factory, what you'll see on the floor tends to be you have a 6 a.m. morning meeting where all the staff comes together. There's usually a flat screen that has some sort of static display chart that might be Excel, it might be PowerPoint, that basically says, here were the overnight metrics. There's a bunch of manually printed sheets around that show things like safety recordables, non-conformance issues, things like that, that the factory has typically brought together an army of industrial engineers to assemble and put those things together so that people can have a briefing for it. What we've done is looked at putting a system together that says, how do I understand, no matter who I am, again, whether I'm the first line supervisor, whether I'm the head of manufacturing, what is being produced in that factory, and how do I click through at each one of those workstations? So, for example, if I'm sitting in a cell and I want to understand what the performance is, how do I have a view that shows me every individual worker on that cell line? If I see, and how is their individual performance? So if I see that one particular person, maybe their efficiency is less than what our expected standard is, I can click through and maybe I can find out, what they're relatively newly trained to the operation, so they don't necessarily have the background. They need a little more coaching. They need some things. Maybe there's an absenteeism problem that might be able to go through there. But it's not just around the visibility of that data. The next thing we want to do is provide specific recommendations for when you do have constraints in the supply chain. How do you solve that? And that's where AI comes in. So we start to look at how do we take things like a part shortage and then provide a visibility platform right next to it that where the mechanic can ask an AI engine right on the floor that says, if this widget's missing, when is the expected delivery date? And then what types of things can I do in terms of a workaround? Maybe I can jiggle the order of operations or things like that to allow me to continue down my work path while the part is still being delivered.
So, I mean, if I can scratch the surface of the parts, there's a few other areas I just want to dig into, but thinking about part visibility. So one of the challenges is that, first of all, there's a lot of systems that will enable you to see your inbound flow. So you can determine what volume is in transit. You can determine what volume is currently being held at customs. You can determine what volume may or may not be subject to tariff changes or ITAR and other restrictions that you have. all of which are being impacting the aerospace industry. But one of the challenges often is making decisions around the total cost. So there's lots of things where you can penny pinch, or you could potentially purchase a part a little bit cheaper from a supplier. You could purchase a part a little bit faster and more expensively from another. But seldom do we have the ability to see the total impact of that decision. So what's been your experience in trying to understand and helping businesses be able to understand the total cost impact of a particular option that they go for?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that distinguishes the aerospace industry from others is the amount of sole and single source decisions that are going into the actual supply chain. So, it's as opposed to like a retail where you may have multiple vendors for any particular good you're purchasing. If you're buying an actuator, there may only be one qualified source, or there may only be one affordable qualified source to go through things. So, one of the things that we're working on is helping companies in those upfront sourcing decisions. So, where they can start to look at not just cost, but what are the overall risk factors in the supply chain? So, as we're all living through right now, the amount of supply chain risk, whether it be geopolitical risk from, you know, war in Ukraine, whether it be tariffs, whether it be natural disaster opportunities, whether it be suppliers who are financially stressed, the amount of risks that are out there and that have to be managed in the supply chain have really outstripped an individual procurement agent or buyer's ability to manage, particularly when you're talking about a portfolio of projects. So what we try to do is put together an AI environment that allows a procurement agent or sourcing decision maker to look at the type of product they're sourcing, input the type of risk factors that it should consider, and then basically give a scorecard to what the risk level is that is being decided on the sourcing decision. Again, we're not making the sourcing decision for the company. That's still 100% the choice of the buyer, the procurement agent up through that authority. But what we're trying to do is inform them not just of the cost impact, but what is the potential risk that might present downstream hidden costs that aren't there in the upfront decision process.
So basically helping with the decision support aspects of a fairly complex series of risks and interdependent risks, etc., which is, is an ideal use of cloud. The other thing that you will do, I'm sure, quite often still, is that we often find ourselves standing in fulfillment centers with customers, and you bring an aerospace customer into an Amazon facility, and they have a chance to see how Amazon works. So you talked about, workers not necessarily having the data during a shift in order to make decisions, where, as you know, in an Amazon facility, we have by the hour, by the minute, understanding of every single process that is being run in the fulfillment center. We can see the variable cost of production for any given SKU. We can make intershift decisions and so forth. And a linked question to this then is, when customers come and see Amazon and they touch Amazon and they get a feel for Amazon, what do you think that sort of culture of innovation and Amazon culture, how does it rub off on the aerospace sector? How do they translate that in a meaningful way?
Yeah, John, I'm glad you brought up culture, because I think when we do invite aerospace customers to tour a fulfillment center, sometimes the reaction ultimately becomes, yeah, but what we're shipping is not books and charging cables and things like that. We're delivering highly specialized items, require specialized packaging, and how am I really going to learn or absorb anything there? So when we do bring customers there, it isn't the idea that you can just copy and paste or lift and shift all the operations or the robotics or anything that happened in the fulfillment center into another environment. It really is 100% about culture, and particularly the culture of data. And I think you kind of highlighted there, things like variable cost analysis, and total cost of ownership. But I think the most important thing is the immediacy of real-time data that's presented to a first line supervisor who can see what things are happening. So we brought the CEO of a large aerostructures manufacturer to one of our fulfillment centers about a year ago. And one of the things he was most impressed by is we were kind of walking through and watching an operator who was picking items and putting them into one of our large Kiva robot stow bins. And a manager came over, has a vest on, says coach on the back, and asked what they were doing, and basically had found out through a dashboard that the operator's performance was a little bit slower than what the standard had been expected for. So they were also able to realize this operator was relatively new to Amazon, so they're still learning on opportunities. So they deployed a coach right away to help the person understand, are there issues that we could help somebody recognize things through. And it's that type of immediacy action that allows you to really kind of reflect on what data can unlock for you as a company. And we ended up spending, I think we had forecasted about 2 hours for the tour. We ended up spending more than 6 hours with him as he just really interrogated the use of data, what it unlocked in terms of innovation, what different things can people do. And when you go through a fulfillment center, anybody who's had an Amazon package delivered, I'm sure will recognize that our packaging has changed. Everything used to come in a very standard corrugate cardboard box. Sometimes people would complain that you might buy an item that's this small and the box is this big. But what we've relied on because of that data is we've been able to shrink the amount of packaging. We've been able to shrink the amount of impact on the environment because we know so much more about form, fit, function of the product being delivered. We'd be able to deliver our own, develop and deliver our own customized packaging for that. And it's those kinds of innovations that really require that type of real-time data analytics and that culture of understanding data and how do you leverage it with immediacy to drive that type of innovation throughout the company.
All right, so companies come and visit. You get to see them all. You've been a consultant before. I'm not going to ask you which is your favorite baby, but I am going to ask
They're
you.
all my favorite.
Of course they are. Every customer is special. I get you. Of all the customers that you're working with, we don't necessarily need names, but maybe, I'm sitting here as a supply chain lead in aerospace, and I'm thinking, interesting, Tim, so far. Who's doing it right? Because we all want to benchmark. Who's out there? What things are being done that are truly, making a difference in the aerospace industry? So what are those sort of 2-3 innovations that are really driving innovation?
Yeah, let me highlight two companies on opposite ends of the spectrum. I'll say. So from a well-known brand, I think a lot of people understand. Let me highlight Safran in France, and Safran is, by all means a legacy company. It's a relatively new brand, but it's the evolvement of several other companies that came together a few years ago, and they make everything from large scale aircraft engines to interiors to cabins and lavatories and things like that. And they have really done a fantastic job of putting together a strategic viewpoint of how they move to the cloud. So when you think about their overall global business, they really started with one of their smaller divisions in the US that focused on how do they just do something simple like move storage to the cloud. And this all happened during the pandemic when revenues were really challenged, particularly in the commercial aviation industry. People aren't ordering airplanes, they're not taking delivery of airplanes, which means they're not taking deliveries of galleys and lavatories. So the CIO there had a lot of pressure on him to reduce IT costs. And one of the things he did was just doing something simple like moving file servers into AWS, because his perspective was, one, it was risk-free, because if he had an issue of disruption, move it back very quickly, no real issue, no challenge to the business itself. Two, it allowed him to fund other innovations. So he was able to return millions of dollars back to the business through retiring virtual machines, retiring legacy hardware very quickly. So that, the idea of moving file servers to the cloud maybe didn't get the board's attention, doesn't sound all that exciting. But when he's able to return $5 million to the business, suddenly that's a whole different perspective on what the cloud can do. So from there, Safran put together essentially a global council for cloud innovation and where where they want to take the business and where they want to move to cloud, that has a very strategic roadmap that looks at, by business, what are the types of innovations they want to take on, and where do they want to maybe wait and see for things that are more critical to the business, and they may roll out things a little bit slower there just to avoid any potential disruption. But their CIO has been a real strong advocate for both the cloud as well as for AWS, and pushing those things for where Safran wants to go. The other company I'll talk about is completely on the other end of the spectrum. This is a startup called Beta Technologies, and Beta makes electric airplanes in Burlington, Vermont, over in the U.S. And they're building both a conventional as well as a vertical takeoff aircraft. And one of the biggest challenges in electric airplanes, obviously, is batteries. And Beta is highly focused on battery lifecycle management. So they're using AWS to track and trace the origin of every battery from the time it gets manufactured on the line, who works on it, who contributes to it, where an individual battery cell gets installed in a pack, where it gets installed on the airplane, and then to stream performance of the battery live as they're doing their certification and test flights, so they can see how battery consumption is happening and what that means in terms of the overall life cycle of the battery. So it's, here we are at the opposite end of the spectrum of a company is actually developing its airplane, developing its powertrain, and understanding what that may look like through the cloud. So it's exciting on both ends of that spectrum.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Two fantastic examples, Tim. I really appreciate that.
So, I mean, Tim, that has been absolutely fantastic, and thanks for all your time thus far. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to quickly get into the next section now, where we're going to look at a little bit more innovation across the aerospace sector.